The cockpit was completely silent, not the calm silence of autopilot over an ocean. The heavy, final silence of a man who has made a decision. Captain Elias Vance's hand hovered over the primary flight controls, his thumb resting on the disconnect switch. 317 lives behind a locked door, hanging on the next 5 seconds. And then a tiny, staticky voice cracked through the intercom. "Hello, Mr. Pilot Man." That voice belonged to 2-year-old Lily Carson. She was in seat 12F, holding a flight attendant's handset she'd found on the floor. And in that one confused question, she interrupted the most tightly guarded, protocol-driven space on Earth, the mind of a pilot in crisis. How does a man entrusted with hundreds of lives reach the edge of oblivion? And how does a toddler, who shouldn't even be heard, become the only thing that can pull him back? To understand that silence in the cockpit, you have to understand the two worlds about to collide. In one, a man following a protocol designed to prevent disaster. In the other, a child who had no idea protocols existed. Captain Elias Vance was, by every professional metric, exemplary. 38 years old, 6,422 hours in the air, a spotless record. He flew the Boeing 787, a 256-passenger transatlantic workhorse for a major global airline. On paper, he was the definition of reliability. The system was built for pilots like him, but the system had a blind spot, one so dangerous it's written into the regulations themselves. If a pilot reports depression or anxiety or seeks therapy, they are immediately grounded. Losing their medical certificate isn't a possibility, it's a guarantee. The process to get it back can take years, cost tens of thousands in mandated evaluations, and offers no promise of success. So pilots learn the only viable strategy. They hide, they perform, they become experts in projecting calm while internally the pressure builds with nowhere to go. Vance had been performing for 11 months. The pressure came from all sides. A divorce finalized 8 months prior, silent and expensive. Alimony, a mortgage on a house that was now just an empty shell. The relentless, grinding schedule that twisted sleep into a constant negotiation with jet lag. And the isolation, the profound, unspoken isolation of the flight deck. You sit inches from another human for hours, communicating in technical shorthand, buried in procedure, while inside, a completely separate monologue runs in a loop you cannot share. To admit vulnerability in that environment is to risk everything. Your career, your identity, your income, so you don't admit it. You lock it away. And for a man like Vance, a man who defined himself by control and competence, that locked box grew heavier every flight. This particular flight was Oceanic 816, New York to London. A Tuesday, a full cabin, 317 souls behind a fortified, bulletproof door that could only be unlocked from his side. He had run the pre-flight checks with robotic precision. His first officer, a capable younger man named Sharma, noticed nothing out of the ordinary. Why would he? Vance's performance was flawless. But as they climbed out over the Atlantic, entering the long, featureless stretch of ocean where radio chatter fades and the autopilot takes over, the silence in the cockpit became something else. It became audible. It became a space where every thought he'd been suppressing for months finally found a voice. The financial ruin, the loneliness, the crushing weight of being the final, solitary point of failure for 256 people who had no idea he was breaking. The system had checked every box for him, except the one that mattered. On the other side of that fortified door in seat 12F was 2-year-old Lily Carson. She was traveling with her mother, Maya, a 27-year-old graphic designer from New Jersey. This was Lily's first flight. Maya was exhausted. The trip was a last-minute, budget-conscious visit to a sick relative in Manchester. The babysitter had cancelled. Maya had done what single mothers have been doing quietly since the beginning of time. She figured it out. She brought Lily. The flight was a 5-hour gauntlet of snacks, iPad games, and desperate attempts to contain the boundless energy of a toddler in a space the size of a broom closet. Lily was fascinated by everything. The seatbelt buckle, the tray table, the flight attendant's smile. She had no concept of altitude, of danger, of the intricate, invisible machinery keeping her aloft. Her world was the immediate, the tangible, the now. And right now, she was bored. Maya had fallen into a shallow, anxious sleep 20 minutes prior, one arm draped protectively over Lily's car seat. Lily, however, was wide awake. She had discovered she could unbuckle the waist strap of her own harness. She wriggled free, her tiny feet finding the floor. She explored the space around their seats, her bright red dress a spot of color in the dim cabin, and that's when she saw it. On the floor, near the rear galley curtain, partially hidden by a fold of service cart fabric. A black handheld radio. A flight attendant's spare handset left behind after a hectic pre-takeoff service, its coiled cord trailing like a tail. To Lily, it wasn't a communication device. It was a new toy, a grown-up telephone. She picked it up with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. She brought it to her ear the way she'd seen her mother do. She heard a faint electric hum, and she pressed the big button on the side. Back in the cockpit, the first officer was focused on a navigational update. Vance was staring at the primary flight display, his hand resting lightly on the control column. The intercom crackle was so sudden, so utterly out of place in the sterile soundscape of the flight deck, that both pilots froze. It wasn't the calm, professional tone of a cabin crew member. It was the high, clear, unformed voice of a very young child. "Hello, Mr. Pilot Man." First Officer Sharma's head snapped toward Vance, confusion etched on his face. What was that? Was that from the cabin? Vance didn't answer immediately. The sound had sliced through the toxic spiral of his thoughts like a physical blade. It was so innocent, so disarmingly out of context, it created a single pure moment of cognitive shock. His professional brain, trained for emergencies, initially categorized it as a systems malfunction, a crossed wire, a prank, but the human part of him, the part he'd been trying to silence, recognized it for what it was: a child. A child was speaking to him from a cabin full of people living their ordinary lives, completely unaware that the man at the controls had been weighing the value of all of them against the weight of his own pain. He reached slowly for the intercom switch to respond, his mind racing, but before his finger could make contact, the system delivered another message. A discreet, persistent chime, a warning from the aircraft's central computer, and on his display, a new line of text flashed, cold and unambiguous. It was a command from air traffic control, rerouting them due to weather, a routine instruction. But to Vance, in that exact moment, it felt like the final, locking click of a trap he'd been building for himself. The outside world was still making its demands. The system was still watching, and in his head, the two realities, the innocent voice and the cold, demanding text, collided. He made a decision, a quiet, terrible decision that defied every protocol, every ounce of his training. He didn't answer the child. Instead, he turned to his first officer, his voice a flat, controlled monotone. "Sharma, I need you to go back to the cabin, right now. There's an intercom fault. I need you to physically locate the source and disconnect it. Take the emergency door key. Do not use the cockpit door keypad. Use the manual override. I'll hold the door lock from here." Sharma stared at him. "Captain, a fault. We should run a diagnostic first. I can." Now, the word left no room for debate. It was the voice of command, the voice that had to be obeyed. Protocol was clear. Under no circumstances should both pilots leave the flight deck, but a direct order from a captain, citing a potential safety issue with cabin communications, created a gray area, a moment of confusion. Sharma, trained to respect the chain of command, hesitated for only a second before unstrapping his harness. "Yes, Captain." He took the emergency door key from its slot, a physical key used only if the electronic systems failed. Vance engaged a hold on the door lock mechanism. With a heavy asterisk thunk, the hydraulic bolts retracted. Sharma pushed the reinforced door open, stepped through into the secure vestibule, and pulled it closed behind him. The bolts re-engaged with a final, solid asterisk clunk asterisk. And just like that, Captain Elias Vance was alone. Alone with the controls, alone with the autopilot set for a course over the deep Atlantic, alone with the silence that was now complete and the decision he had just irrevocably set in motion. He had created the exact scenario aviation security had sworn to prevent since a Tuesday in March 2015. He was the only person alive who knew what he intended to do next. The child's voice had been a temporary interruption. Now, there was nothing left to interrupt him. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed the voice was an accident, a random button press. He didn't account for the stubborn, curious nature of a 2-year-old who had just discovered a magic talking box. As Sharma began his confused search in the galley, Lily Carson, sitting back in her seat with the handset clutched in both hands, pressed the button again. She had heard a man's voice, different from the first one. She wanted the first one back, the Mr. Pilot man. The intercom in the silent, locked cockpit crackled to life a second time. The sound was a lifeline he hadn't asked for, thrown into a dark sea. "You there?" Lily's voice asked, filled with the cheerful confusion of a game. In the sterile quiet of the locked cockpit, those two words did something no emergency checklist ever could. They demanded an answer. Captain Vance's hand jerked back from the autopilot controls as if burned. His breath hitched. Every fiber of his training screamed that this was a breach, a distraction, a problem to be eliminated. But the human part of him, the part that had been buried under layers of professional armor and silent despair, heard something else. A connection, a tiny, stubborn thread of contact with a world that felt miles away. He stared at the intercom panel, the small green light indicating an open channel from the cabin. He could shut it off with one button press. Isolate himself completely. That was the plan. That was the only way to do what he had decided to do. But his finger wouldn't move. The voice was waiting. In the cabin, First Officer Sharma was moving down the aisle with a forced calm, his eyes scanning seatbacks and galley walls for a non-existent fault. He nodded politely at a passenger, his mind racing. The captain's order made no technical sense. An intercom fault wouldn't require a manual search and disconnect. It would trigger a master caution light on the flight deck. And why send him out, leaving the cockpit solo for a minor cabin issue? The pieces refused to fit. His training had drilled into him a fundamental rule: trust, but verify. And right now, nothing about this scenario was verifiable. He reached the rear galley where two flight attendants were preparing a service. "Have you seen a loose handset?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low. A passenger might have picked one up. Meanwhile, Lily, receiving no answer, was undeterred. She pressed the button again. This time she blew into the microphone. A loud, static-laden puff of air erupted in the cockpit, followed by her giggle. The absurdity of it, the sheer innocent normality of a child blowing into a microphone, cracked the glacial surface of Vance's resolve. A sound escaped him, not a word, not a laugh. A short, sharp exhale that was almost a sob. He found his finger moving, not to disconnect, but to transmit. His voice, when it came through the speakers in the cabin, was rough, unfamiliar. "I'm here." In seat 12F, Lily's eyes went wide with delight. She had done it. She had talked to the magic sky man. She pressed the button, speaking quickly. "I see clouds, big white ones." Vance closed his eyes. He saw them too. 37,000 feet below, the North Atlantic stretched out, cold and infinite. The autopilot held them steady on a course that would, in less than an hour, enter a zone of procedural no return. But for this moment, he was just a voice talking about clouds. "They're very big," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Like mountains." This conversation, this bizarre, impossible dialogue, was being broadcast on the cabin overhead speakers. Passengers looked up, confused. A few smiled, assuming it was some kind of crew member's child on a special tour. Maya, Lily's mother, awoke with a start. The voice was coming from everywhere, and then she looked at her daughter. Lily was holding a black flight attendant handset, her tiny thumb firmly on the button, speaking with intense concentration. Maya's blood ran cold. "Lily, no. Give that to me." She reached for it, but Lily, sensing the end of her game, clutched it to her chest and turned away, pressing the button again. "Mama says no." First Officer Sharma heard the exchange over the cabin speakers. He heard the captain's voice. He stopped dead in the aisle, the reality crashing into him. There was no intercom fault. The captain was alone in the cockpit, and he was talking to a toddler on the public address system. Every alarm bell in Sharma's mind began ringing at once. This was not just unusual. This was a textbook red flag. A deviation from standard operating procedure, so severe it could only mean one thing: the pilot in command was compromised. His earlier confusions snapped into a cold, sharp focus. He abandoned his search for the handset and began moving quickly back toward the front of the cabin. He had to get back into the cockpit. Now. On the flight deck, Vance was clinging to the thread of Lily's voice. It was the only anchor in a rising storm of panic. She was asking him about his house, if he had a dog, why the sky was blue. Simple, impossible questions that required simple human answers. Each answer he gave was a small rebellion against the finality he had planned. But the clock was ticking. The systems were monitoring, and his first officer was now a potential threat. He saw, on a secondary display, the door access log. The door had been unlocked and relocked. Sharma was in the vestibule. He was trying to get back in. Vance's hand flew to the door lock panel. He could override any entry attempt from inside. He could keep Sharma out indefinitely, but that action alone would be a declaration of hostile intent. It would trigger a silent alarm at the airline's operations center. It would unmask him completely. He hesitated, his fingers hovering. Lily's voice piped up again. "You got a little girl." The question was a physical blow. Vance had a daughter, Sophia. She was 9. She lived with her mother in California. He hadn't seen her in 4 months. The last time they'd video called, she'd asked him why he was always so tired. He had told her daddy just worked a lot. He saw her face now, superimposed over the instrument panel. The guilt was a tidal wave, and it brought with it a crushing clarity. What he was about to do would destroy her. It would define her entire life. She would be the girl whose father was the pilot who... He couldn't finish the thought. A low, guttural sound of anguish tore from his throat. He slammed his fist against the side panel once, twice. The pain was clean, sharp. It grounded him. On the door camera monitor, he could see First Officer Sharma's face, pale and serious, holding up his ID to the camera. A universal gesture requesting entry, standard procedure. Behind Sharma, visible through the vestibule window, a senior flight attendant had appeared, her expression concerned. Vance was trapped between two realities. The sealed, terminal reality of the locked cockpit and the living, breathing, questioning reality of the cabin, represented by a 2-year-old with a handset and an officer at his door. The system had given him absolute authority in this room, and he was using it to orchestrate a catastrophe. But the system had no protocol for this. No checklist for a pilot being slowly pulled back from the edge by the sound of a child blowing into a microphone. He made a decision, not the final one, but a pivotal one. He would not lock Sharma out, not yet. He opened the intercom to the cabin address once more, his voice strained but clear. "Lily, I need you to be very brave for me. Can you give the phone to the man in the uniform, the one standing next to your mama?" In the cabin, all eyes turned to seat 12F. Maya pried the handset gently from Lily's grip. Lily, suddenly shy, buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Maya, her hands trembling, held the handset out to First Officer Sharma, who had just reached their row. He took it, his professional mask firmly in place, but his eyes were wide with unspoken urgency. He keyed the handset, speaking directly to the cockpit on a private crew frequency. "Captain, this is Sharma. I have the handset. What is your status?" His voice was calm, but the question was loaded. Vance heard the shift to the professional channel. The game was over. The child was gone. He was back in the world of procedures and consequences. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "My status is," he faltered. What could he say? "I am in psychological freefall. I just almost killed us all. My status is, I require a relief. I'm unfit to continue as pilot flying." The words spoken aloud into the system were an atomic confession. In the aviation world, a pilot declaring themselves unfit is an event of seismic gravity. It triggers immediate, irreversible protocols. Sharma's training kicked into overdrive. His primary duty was no longer to question, but to contain. "Understood, Captain. I am requesting entry to the flight deck to assume pilot flying duties." This was the critical juncture. If Vance let him in, he surrendered all control. The event would be documented, investigated, and his career would be over. But if he refused, he escalated the situation into a potential hostile barricade. The child's voice had brought him to the precipice of a choice. Now he had to make it. He looked at the door camera. He saw Sharma waiting. He saw the reflection of his own face in the dark glass of the windshield, etched with exhaustion and tear tracks. He thought of Sophia. He thought of Lily asking about clouds. His hand moved to the door lock control. He pressed the button to release the hydraulic bolts. The sound of the door unlocking was a soft, mechanical sigh. In the vestibule, Sharma tensed, ready for anything. He pushed the door open and stepped back into the cockpit. The atmosphere was thick, charged. Vance was still in the left seat, his harness on, his hands in his lap. He did not look at Sharma. "The aircraft is yours," he said, his voice hollow. Sharma slid into the right seat, his movements efficient and swift. His first action was not to take the controls, but to reach up and select a new transponder code. He entered the numbers 7700, the universal squawk code for an emergency. Instantly, Every air traffic control radar screen tracking Oceanic 816 lit up with a flashing red icon. On the ground, in control centers across 2 continents, alarms would be sounding. The aircraft had just declared an emergency. Sharma's next action was to key the radio. Shanwick Oceanic Control, Oceanic 816, emergency, emergency, emergency. We are declaring a pilot medical emergency. Request immediate priority handling and diversion to the nearest suitable airport. The response from air traffic control was immediate, a voice crackling with professional calm. Oceanic 816, Shanwick copies emergency, stand by for revised routing, confirm nature of medical emergency. Sharma looked at Vance, who had put his head in his hands. Confirm, Shanwick, pilot incapacitation, second officer is now pilot flying, requesting direct to. Sharma scanned his navigation display, calculating, direct to Shannon, Ireland. Oceanic 816 is cleared direct Shannon. Descend at your discretion to flight level 240. Medical services will be standing by. Is the incapacitated pilot secure? Sharma reached over and gently, firmly placed a hand on Vance's shoulder. It was not a gesture of restraint, but of stark human acknowledgement. The captain is secure, Sharma said into the radio, his eyes on the broken man beside him. We have the situation contained. But that was the crucial, terrifying lie, because the situation was far from contained. It was only just beginning. The declaration of an emergency had set in motion a vast, unstoppable machine. On the ground, the airline's crisis management team was scrambling into a secure conference room. Regulators were being notified. In Shannon, airport emergency vehicles were rolling into position. And in a cabin filled with 317 now anxious passengers, a little girl in a red dress was asking her mother why the airplane was turning. The immediate danger had been averted, but the fallout, the investigation, the dissection of how a man like Elias Vance could be brought to that moment was a storm gathering on the horizon. And at the center of that storm was a recording. A digital log of every word exchanged between a suicidal pilot and a toddler. A recording that would soon be pulled from the aircraft's black box and played in silent, sterile rooms by men with no concept of what those words had actually cost. Contained, that's what First Officer Sharma told Air Traffic Control. But on the ground, as Oceanic 816 began its emergency descent into Shannon, a different word was being used. A clinical, terrifying word: contamination. It referred not to virus, but to information. The airline's crisis protocol was a document written in the blood of past disasters. Its first priority, secure the aircraft. Its second, isolate the narrative. Even as the plane touched down smoothly at Shannon Airport, surrounded by flashing lights of emergency vehicles that turned out to be unnecessary, a team from the airline's corporate security was already in the air on a private jet from London. Their mission was not to care for Captain Vance. It was to secure the digital flight recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the black boxes, before the Irish Air Accident Investigation Unit could claim them under international treaty. This was the gray zone between corporate liability and sovereign law, and the airline intended to win. They reached the aircraft, still parked on a remote apron, its passengers being bussed to a terminal under the confused guise of a medical diversion. The security lead, a former military man, presented authorization papers to the shell-shocked crew. They downloaded the data from the black boxes onto a secure drive. They took the original handset from Lily Carson, bagging it as evidence. They interviewed First Officer Sharma in a makeshift office, their questions precise, legalistic, and aimed at one outcome: framing the incident as a sudden acute medical event, a stroke, a seizure, anything but a premeditated psychological crisis. Sharma, loyal to his captain but terrified of the truth, walked a tightrope. He described Vance's confusion, his unusual orders. He did not mention the content of the conversation with the child, not yet. That tape, he was told, was a privacy issue, a sensitive matter involving a minor. It would be handled internally. Captain Vance was taken off the aircraft on a stretcher, an oxygen mask over his face, a prudent measure for a possible cardiac event. It also had the benefit of obscuring his face from the phone cameras of disembarking passengers. He was rushed to a private clinic in Shannon, not the public hospital. The door to his room was guarded by a man in a suit employed by the airline's insurer. His personal phone was taken. He was, for all intents and purposes, disappeared into the machinery of corporate risk management. But the story was already escaping. Passengers had cell phones. They had heard a child's voice over the speakers, then a man's strained replies. They saw the urgent scramble of the first officer. By the time the last bus left the tarmac, social media threads were stitching together a bizarre, half-true narrative. Pilot talks to kid on speaker, plane makes emergency landing. The airline's press office released a 3-sentence statement citing an unforeseen medical situation involving a flight crew member and praising the swift and professional actions of the remaining crew. It made no mention of a locked cockpit, no mention of a toddler. It was a masterpiece of omission. This is where the second wave of consequences began, the one nobody in the crisis room had fully anticipated, because while they were busy containing Vance, they had forgotten about the other key witness, a witness who could not be intimidated, who had no understanding of non-disclosure agreements, and whose mother was now sitting in a hotel room in Shannon, holding her daughter and watching the news in mounting horror. Maya Carson had one goal: protect Lily, but the airline's representatives who had provided the hotel were now politely pressuring her to sign a document. It was a goodwill gesture agreement, a substantial sum of money for travel disruption in exchange for her family's confidentiality regarding the distressing in-flight events. The man presenting it was gentle, understanding. He emphasized how stressful litigation would be, how the media would hound them, how it was best for everyone, especially little Lily, to just move on. Maya, exhausted and scared, initially agreed. She took the document to read, and buried in the legalese, she found a clause that made her blood run cold. It required her to affirm that Captain Vance had at no point posed a deliberate threat to the safety of the aircraft. She was being asked to sign a lie to protect the airline from a negligence lawsuit. She refused. That night she called her brother in New York, a personal injury lawyer. He listened, and his response was immediate. Do not sign anything. Talk to no one from the airline. This is bigger than a payoff. They are covering up a system failure. He connected her with a former NTSB investigator turned aviation safety advocate. This man, David Ross, had spent 20 years fighting against the stigma surrounding pilot mental health. When Maya described the conversation she'd heard, Lily's questions about clouds, the pilot's shaky answers, Ross knew instantly what he was hearing. This wasn't a medical event. This was an intervention, a miraculous, accidental intervention, and the airline was trying to bury it. Ross contacted a trusted journalist at a major newspaper. He gave them the bare facts, no names, positioning it as a safety issue. The next morning, the headline broke: Mid-Atlantic mystery. Did a toddler's voice avert an air disaster? The article was careful, citing unnamed sources, but it pointed directly to the glaring contradiction: an emergency landing for a pilot's medical issue, coupled with passenger accounts of a strange, public conversation. It asked the question the airline dreaded. What medical condition explains a pilot conversing with a child before being relieved of duty? Damn cracked. The Irish authorities, who had been politely sidelined, now formally demanded the black box data from the airline, citing their jurisdictional authority. The FAA and EASA, the American and European aviation regulators, opened parallel inquiries. Reporters descended on Shannon, on Vance's home in the suburbs, on the airline's headquarters. The corporate narrative of a sudden physical illness began to crumble under the weight of a single, unanswerable detail: the transcript. Because while the airline fought legal battles over data custody, the official investigation had already begun its work. In a soundproof room in Dublin, investigators played the cockpit voice recording from the final hour of Oceanic 816. They heard the heavy silence. They heard the first, miraculous crackle of Lily's "Hello, Mr. Pilot Man." They heard the long pause, the shuddering breath, and Captain Vance's broken, "I'm here." They heard the entire surreal exchange about clouds and dogs and little girls. They heard his sob. They heard his fist hitting the panel. They heard the moment he declared himself unfit. For the investigators, hardened professionals who had listened to the final moments of doomed flights, This tape was unlike anything in their experience. It was not a recording of a crash. It was a recording of a crash being averted in real time by the most fragile of threads. A preliminary report was leaked. Not the whole thing, but a single devastating page. The *Irish Independent ran it. It contained a direct quote from the cockpit voice recorder transcript. Vance's voice, identified as the captain, "I see them too. They're very big, like mountains." And below it, the investigator's dry clinical note. This exchange occurs concurrently with the aircraft's autopilot being engaged on a course that would have exhausted its fuel over the North Atlantic. The subsequent dialogue with the minor passenger appears to function as a sustained cognitive interruption to the pilot's previously established trajectory. The public didn't need the technical jargon translated. The implication was nuclear. The pilot hadn't just been taken ill, he had been on a suicide course, and a toddler with a microphone had talked him down. The story was now global. It was no longer an aviation incident. It was a human parable. The little girl who saved a plane. News vans camped outside Maya's sister's house in New Jersey, where she and Lily had finally returned. Lily's picture, her bright red dress and curly hair, was everywhere. The airline's stock price plummeted. Talking heads on cable news debated pilot mental health, asking how many other Captain Vances were in the skis right now. The families of the victims of the Germanwings crash 2015 gave emotional interviews, asking why the lessons of that tragedy had clearly not been learned. And in the quiet, guarded clinic room in Shannon, Elias Vance was presented with a choice. The airline's lawyers laid it out for him. He could maintain the acute medical crisis story. They would provide him with the best psychiatric care at a private facility. They would support his family financially during his recovery. His medical retirement would be honorable. In exchange, he would never speak publicly about the events of that flight. He would never mention the child, the handset, or his state of mind. The alternative was to be cut adrift. He would face a brutal public inquiry, possible criminal negligence charges depending on how Irish authorities ruled, the certain permanent revocation of his license, and the total ruin of his family's finances. He would be the monster in the cockpit. The choice was between a comfortable, silent oblivion and a truth that would burn down the remains of his life. Vance asked for 24 hours to decide. He spent it staring at the wall, the weight of 317 lives, of his daughter Sophia, of a little girl in a red dress he'd never met, pressing down on him. The system had offered him a trapdoor, a way to disappear quietly and let the corporation plaster over the cracks. But he kept hearing Lily's question, "You got a little girl." He thought of Sophia, growing up with the ghost of a father who vanished under a cloud of lies. He thought of the other pilots, sitting in cockpits right now, holding their own silent, private battles because the system punished honesty. The easy choice was to be silent. The right choice was to become the thing the system feared most, a whistleblower from inside the cockpit. He called the lead Irish investigator. He said he was ready to give a full, sworn statement, not just about that Tuesday, but about the 11 months that led to it. About the fear, the hiding, the systemic pressure to lie on medical forms, the culture of silence that treated mental health as a career-ending disgrace. He was going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and in doing so, he would pull the pin on a grenade inside the entire aviation industry. The containment had failed. The contamination was now total, and the reckoning was about to begin in hearing rooms and boardrooms across the world, with a broken captain and a toddler's innocent voice echoing through every single word. Elias Vance's testimony did not begin in a courtroom. It began in a small, windowless conference room at the Irish Air Accident Investigation Unit's headquarters, with a cup of cold coffee and a digital recorder. For 8 hours, he methodically dismantled his own life, and in doing so, exposed the fragile facade of an entire industry. He started not with the Tuesday of the flight, but with the Tuesday 14 months prior, the day his divorce was finalized. He spoke about the shame of hiding his depression from the airline's medical examiner during his last mandatory checkup. He described the exact wording of the form. "Have you ever been diagnosed with, or have you ever known, or have you ever suspected you had?" He explained how every pilot reads that question as a career termination device. He confessed he lied. He walked the investigators through his financial spiral, the isolation of his schedule, the constant fear that a single prescription for an antidepressant discovered would end everything. He gave them names. The therapist he saw in another city, paying in cash. The online support forum for pilots where users posted anonymously, terrified of digital footprints. He provided a map of a secret, parallel world that existed because the official one offered no safe path. Then he got to Oceanic 816. He described the heaviness that settled during the climb-out, the intrusive, detailed calculation of fuel range versus ocean, the absolute clarity of his decision, and then the voice. He called it the auditory life raft. He explained, with a chilling technical precision, how Lily's first question had created a cognitive fork in the road. One path led back to the planned trajectory, the other led to answering her. And for reasons he still couldn't fully articulate, he chose to answer. He credited First Officer Sharma's professionalism. He absolved the airline's crew of any blame. He placed the fault squarely on two entities, himself and the system that made his silence a rational survival strategy. The final report from the Irish investigation was a thunderclap. It concluded that the primary cause of the serious incident was the deliberate actions of the captain, who was experiencing a severe, undisclosed depressive episode. But the systemic cause was a regulatory and cultural environment that incentivizes concealment of mental health conditions through disproportionate professional and financial penalties. It recommended a complete overhaul of pilot mental health protocols, including anonymous reporting pathways, mandatory, non-punitive psychological support programs, and a shift from a punishment-based model to a treatment-based one. The report was especially scathing about the airline's initial attempts to sequester evidence and control the narrative, calling it an obstruction to the fundamental principle of safety improvement. The dominoes began to fall. The FAA and EASA, facing massive public and political pressure, announced a joint task force. Class action lawsuits were filed against the airline by passengers, not for the emergency landing, but for the intentional endangerment they now understood had occurred. The airline's CEO was forced to testify before a parliamentary transport committee. His evasive answers about the company's culture of care made headlines. The stock price took another hit. The board demanded change. For Vance, the consequences were severe, but they carried a strange, clean pain. His pilot's license was permanently revoked. He faced no criminal charges in Ireland, as his actions, while deliberate, were deemed a result of a severe mental health crisis for which he had sought no help because the system discouraged it. He was, however, civilly liable. The airline sued him for the costs of the diversion, the damaged aircraft, and the reputational harm. He declared bankruptcy. He moved into a small apartment. He began intensive, proper therapy, this time openly. His relationship with his daughter, Sophia, became his anchor. He explained to her in age-appropriate terms that Daddy had been very sick and was getting help. She visited on weekends. It was fragile and it was real. For Maya and Lily Carson, life became a different kind of whirlwind. They declined all lucrative media deals and book offers. Maya used a portion of the eventual settlement from the airline to go back to school. Lily started preschool. They moved to a quieter town. Maya's one public statement was a letter read by her lawyer. It said, in part, "We are grateful everyone is safe. Our focus is on our daughter's peaceful childhood. We will not be participating in the ongoing story. We ask for privacy." The world, fascinated by the little girl who saved a plane, largely respected it. Lily's image faded from the news, but her impact did not. The most profound changes were the ones you couldn't see. Inside major airlines, new policies were drafted, rushed into effect. Confidential, third-party mental health hotlines were established for flight crew. The mandatory medical exam forms were rewritten, their language softened to encourage disclosure. A major U.S. carrier announced a groundbreaking policy. Pilots could seek mental health treatment without automatic grounding, subject to a monitored, supportive return-to-work program. It was a direct result of the pressure generated by the Oceanic 816 case. In crew rooms, the conversation shifted. Pilots began speaking quietly to each other, using words they once would have whispered. "Are you okay?" became a legitimate question. 2 years after that Tuesday over the Atlantic, the joint FAA-EASA task force published its new global framework. It was dubbed the Carson Protocols, a quiet, official nod to a little girl in a red dress. The protocols mandated annual, non-punitive mental health check-ins for all commercial pilots, strict confidentiality protections, and the establishment of peer support networks within airlines. The era of mandatory, punitive grounding for seeking help was officially declared over. The head of the FAA's medical division called it the most significant shift in aviation safety culture since the advent of the crew resource management. The story seemed to have reached its logical end, a crisis, a revelation, systemic change. But there was one final, private meeting that nobody documented. It happened in a park in California, arranged through a series of careful intermediary emails. Elias Vance waited on a bench, nervous. Maya Carson walked up holding Lily's hand. Lily was now 4, her hair in puffier curls, wearing yellow overalls, not red. She clutched a different stuffed animal, a worn elephant. Vance stood. He had no words prepared. Maya spoke first. "It's okay," she said softly. "We just wanted to say hello." Lily looked at him, curious. She had no memory of him, of his voice, of the clouds. To her, he was just a man in the park. Vance knelt down, his eyes level with hers. "Hi, Lily," he said, his voice thick. "Hi," she said, then hid her face in her mother's leg, suddenly shy. Vance looked up at Maya, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he managed to say, for bringing her that day, for letting her be who she is." Maya nodded. "She asks about the airplane sometimes. I tell her she was very brave and very kind. That's the story she knows." They talked for 10 minutes about ordinary things. The weather, Lily's love for dinosaurs. Then Maya said they should go. As they turned to leave, Lily let go of her mother's hand, ran back, and without a word, wrapped her arms around Vance's knees in a brief, fierce toddler hug. Then she ran back to her mother, took her hand, and they walked away. Vance sat back on the bench, the sun warm on his face. He watched them disappear around a path. He did not feel redeemed. He did not feel healed. He felt something simpler and perhaps more important, present. The ghost of the man in the cockpit, the one calculating descent rates into an ocean, finally seemed to dissolve in the California light. He was just a man on a bench who had been lost and was now slowly finding his way back. The silence around him was no longer heavy. It was just quiet, the kind of silence that comes from peace. The systems were changing, the protocols were written, the headlines had moved on. But in that park, and in the lives quietly rebuilt, the real resolution was taking root. It wasn't in the regulations, but in the understanding that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected place. And sometimes, the only thing strong enough to break a system designed for perfect, silent control is the sound of an innocent question, asked into the void, and the courage of a broken man to finally answer it. We build systems to eliminate human error. We reinforce doors, write protocols, and trust in flawless execution. But what happens when the greatest point of failure isn't a mechanical part, but the silent, suffering human at the controls? The story of Oceanic 816 is not a story about a heroic toddler, though Lily's innocence was the catalyst. It is not solely a story about a broken pilot, though Elias Vance's pain was the engine. It is a story about a crack in the wall, a revelation that our most sophisticated systems are only as strong as the willingness of the people inside them to be seen, to be vulnerable, to ask for help without facing ruin. For decades, aviation safety was about the machine, metal fatigue, software glitches, weather radar. And then, a Tuesday in March 2015 taught the world that a determined, suffering person could bypass all of it. The response was more locks, more barriers, more isolation. The oceanic flight showed us the opposite truth, that the remedy wasn't more isolation, but more connection. The lock that needed to be picked wasn't on the cockpit door, but on the culture of silence surrounding the mind of the person sitting behind it. The Carson protocols, the changed forms, the support hotlines, these are the tangible outcomes, but the intangible one is more important. It's the conversation that started in crew rooms and living rooms. It's the understanding that mental health isn't a disqualification for duty. It's a condition of being human that requires care, like physical health. The ultimate safety feature isn't a thicker door. It's a culture where a pilot can say, "I am not okay," and be met with support, not a subpoena. This story moved through the world like a whisper that became a roar. It asked us a difficult question. Where else in our world do we demand superhuman perfection while punishing basic human need? Where else have we built elegant, intricate systems that work perfectly, right up until the moment a human heart breaks inside them? If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time you carried a weight no one could see, or of a moment when a simple, unexpected kindness changed your trajectory, then you understand why we tell these stories. We don't tell them for the spectacle. We tell them for the quiet truth at the center. The truth that sometimes the most powerful force isn't a rule or a weapon or a barrier. It's a question. You there? It's an answer. I'm here. It's the fragile, miraculous thread of contact between two souls that somehow holds the weight of an entire world. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that thread exists. Leave a comment below about a moment when a small connection made a big difference in your life. And if you believe in stories that dig beneath the headline to find the human heartbeat, subscribe. We'll be here, waiting for the next story worth staying for.